So how do you know if we are successful as a church? It's a really critical question because how we answer that question really determines the whole direction that we go in as a church and what we value and what we do. There have generally been two ways of answering that question that churches have done. One is that the mark of success is that we keep our traditions, that in a world that is changing, we're the one institution that doesn't change, that we stay the same, that our services stay the same, our worship stays the same, our method stays the same, and we're faithful because we don't change. That's the mark that we're a successful church. The other mark of being a successful church is that we build a really big box and we fill it with lots of people and we make lots of noise and there's lots of activity. And if we do that, then we have been a successful church. The only problem with both of those ways of measuring success as a church is that neither of them have anything to do with anything spiritual. They have nothing to do with our really growing as disciples to be more like Christ. And actually, neither of them are things that the Bible commands us to do anywhere. And so in this matters tremendously because how we measure success, how we think about and picture what it means to be a successful church of successful Christians derives the direction for everything that we do. And so rather than falling into one of these two methods that so many churches fall into, we need to stop and rethink and reimagine, God, how do you measure success? What does that look like to you? Now, this is the final week in our series on the kingdom culture of our eco movement. And we've talked about our movement as eco, how we are reformed, how we are evangelical, how we are egalitarian. We've talked about our 4 values, that we believe in the complete local in terms of how we picture that all of us are ministers. In a livable theology, the reason we learn about God isn't so we can be Bible fatheads, but so we can live out what we know about God. That we've learned about our mutual spurring, that we're meant to spur and encourage each other on. And we've learned about your leadership acceleration. We want to be about supporting each other, to be disciples, to be learners, and to be leaders in God's kingdom. But the final week is when we come together and we just ask, how do you measure this? How do you know when we've been successful and when they haven't? And I want to tell you something I love about eco is that we don't measure success by that we're traditional and we never change. And we don't measure success by we build a big box and fill it with lots of people. That we've got 6 different measures in terms of how we think about what we're aiming for, what we're looking for. And I want to walk through those in an unusual way that we're going to open up the Bible to Judges chapter 6 and 7 and look at the story of Gideon. And this is an amazing story and really gives us a picture biblically of what it means to be successful. And it's not necessarily what we would expect. And so I want to invite you to turn there with me to Judges chapter 6 and chapter 7. Now this, as many of the stories of the Old Testament, they're military stories. Now the world of 1208 BC that we're talking about was a very violent world, as much of the Old Testament was. And one of the beauties of a lot of the military metaphors in the Old Testament is it's very clear and you can really see a lot of the principles. But what we're not meant to discern from these military stories in the Old Testament is that we're fighting a military war or our enemies or people that we want to kill or hurt in any way. And so we're looking at what are the deeper spiritual measures that we see in this passage in Gideon in Judges 6 and 7. So I invite you to turn there with me. You can do that in the Bible you brought from home. You can do that on your phones. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, or you will see the words in the screen behind me. We're going to start in Judges 6:11. Now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth at Orpah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezrite, while his son Gideon was beating out the wheat in the winepress to hide it from the Midianites. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, "The Lord is with you, O mighty man of valor." And Gideon said to him, "Please, sir, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened to us? And where are all his wonderful deeds that our fathers recounted to us, saying, 'Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt?'" but the Lord has forsaken us and given us into the hand of Midian. So it's 1208 BC. I want you to bring up the map that Israel had been invaded by a coalition of Midianites, Amalekites, several other nations. And they had gone in with an army of 135,000 troops with armor, with weapons, trained, and just completely overwhelmed Israel. That here it's been 200 years since God delivered them. They came up out of Egypt. They inherited the promised land through Joshua, and all kinds of amazing things happened. But honestly, it's been one disaster after the next for the last 200 years. This period of the Judges was a brutally hard period. And so Gideon, as many of the Israelites, were really struggling. That he's hiding from the Midianites, that he's filled with doubt, that he's defeated, that he's like, I'm really having a hard time trusting that God is real and that the same God that delivered us from Egypt is going to deliver us now, because it really doesn't look very good right now. So Gideon's a doubter. He's the doubting Thomas of the Old Testament. I'm really having a hard time believing in God. I'm really having a hard time having faith. Does God work in people's lives and at times when we doubt, when we're hiding, when we don't see God anywhere? Verse 14, and the Lord turned to him and said, go in this might of yours and save Israel from the hand of Midian. Did I not send you? And he said to him, please, Lord, how can I save Israel? Behold, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house. And the Lord said to him, but I will be with you, and you shall strike the Midianites as one man. Here Gideon is hiding. He's defeated. He's doubting. He's weak. But God looks at him and says, here's a mighty man of valor. That God looks at Gideon as the man that he can be. Have you thought about that? Maybe you look at where you are right now, and maybe you're doubting and defeated and struggling. But you know, when God looks at you, that's not what he sees. He sees the man or woman that you can be. If you would open up your heart and let the Spirit of God fill you and move you and change you and deepen you. And so the first thing, when they've got a depressing time that's fearful, is God focuses on the mission at hand. I have called you to do something amazing. I've called you to defeat the Midianites. And so this is the first measure of eco, that we nurture missional living, that this is really the heart of how a church comes alive, that we focus on what is the mission that God has called us to do. Now, at the last Eco Conference, which was just a couple weeks ago, I heard something that I'd never heard before that I think was so helpful. They said, you don't measure your church by what happens on Sunday morning. It's great if we have a great worship service. It's great if we have a lot of people. It's great if we have great music or a great sermon, but that's not the ultimate measure of a church. Think of your Sunday morning service as halftime. Now, I think I'm still a Packer fan. I'm kind of wrestling. I'm having an identity crisis since I moved to New York. But I loved watching Aaron Rodgers play the last 15 years. So when Aaron Rodgers kind of moved to the Jets, I kind of felt a kinship with him, like a Wisconsinite moving to New York. And I've been really excited to see Aaron Rodgers play. And honestly, I'm really disappointed at what I'm watching. And I was watching the game on Thursday night, and it was literally Aaron Rodgers' worst game ever. I mean, maybe the game where he got injured on play number 4 was the worst, but it was pathetic. And it's like, not just that the Jets look bad, but Aaron Rodgers looks really bad. And they came in at halftime, and Aaron Rodgers said, Davante Adams gave a speech to us that was so real and honest, and he reminded us of what we were there for and what we were about. And they came out of that locker room changed, and shockingly, the Jets beat the Titans. Because at halftime, they were just frustrated and failing and struggling. At halftime, they came together, and they were reminded who they were and what they were about. So, you know what these worship services are? It's halftime. That the real mark of our church and what we're doing isn't actually what happens here. It's what happens Monday through Saturday. Because honestly, you and I come in here on Sunday morning and we're battered and bruised and worried and scared from all the junk that happened to us this week. And we come back and we walk in and we look up at the door and it says that we exist to honor God by making more disciples of Jesus Christ. It's like, oh yeah. What matters most isn't all the things that are buzzing in my head. It's that I'm a follower of Jesus Christ and he's called me to make disciples. And we get recentered and refocused. And we come out ready to win. And so this is really where it starts. That we stop, that it's not do we keep our traditions, it's not do we build a big box. Do you and I know why we're here? Do you and I know what we're called to? The mission matters more. Verse 17, and he said to him, so struggling with his faith, he's not just going to believe because God even appears to him and tells him, I need proof in order to believe. Verse 21, jump ahead. Then the angel of the Lord reached out the tip of his staff that was in his hand and touched the meat and the unleavened cakes. And fire sprang up from the rock and consumed the flesh and the unleavened cakes. And the angel of the Lord vanished from his sight. And so God showed Gideon a sign. God proved himself to Midian. He saw the unleavened cakes burn with fire. He saw the angel of the Lord appear to him and then disappear in that moment. And God wasn't afraid to prove himself to Gideon. And then fast forward to verse 36. We see the most famous thing that Gideon is known for, his signature event. This is verse 36 to 40. Then Gideon said to God, if you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I'm laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said. And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on the ground let there be dew. And God did so that night. And it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. And so Gideon is the Thomas of the Old Testament. I'll believe, but God, I need you to prove yourself first. Do you know that's okay? Honestly, that's how I am. Like as an atheist, I needed God to prove himself to me. I still need God to prove himself to me. I can't just believe by blind faith. I'm not wired that way. And a lot of you aren't either. And that's okay. That God isn't calling you and I to be this generic Christian like someone else. God has created each one of us with a unique identity and a unique calling. And it's being true to who God has made you that God is calling you. And this is so freeing as a disciple that God did not expect Gideon to try to become like any of the other Bible heroes. God knew him as he was and called him as he was. And so the second measure that we'll call it to is to know our unique identity and calling. And I want to tell you, this is a breath of fresh air. And so often when we've talked about church health in churches around the nation that we have, and usually it's the big box church, that we should be just like Saddleback or Willow Creek or Name X Church that builds a big box and fills it full of people. And if we're not like that, there's something wrong with us. And so wherever place we end up being, whatever people we have, whatever our history and whatever God has made us to, we have to change who we are to be like that big box church. And Eco is saying, that doesn't really work because every church is unique. The people in the church are unique. The setting that we're placed in is unique. The passions and callings on a church are unique. And we don't succeed by trying to be like somebody else. We succeed by saying, Lord, who have you made us to be? Who have you made me to be? Where have you called us to? What unique abilities have you given us and unique needs in our community you're calling us to meet? Now, I shared with you before, I literally looked at over 100 churches all around the nation when God was calling Heather and I to leave Wisconsin and go to anywhere that he would call us. And when I think about those 100 churches, they literally fall in just two categories. There were several church profiles that would just say, we want a conservative pastor that will be conservative in our church and make sure that our church doesn't change in a world that's changing. And that was what they saw as success, is to make sure that we never change as a church. We always believe exactly the same thing. We always do the same ministries, and we look exactly the same as we have. Sorry, I just wasn't interested in that. That felt like a straitjacket to me. Like, that's not the way I'm wired. Well, then there were another set of churches that said, we've got a big box. Look at all the pictures of our big box. And we've got lots of people. Look at all the pictures of our lots of people. So we want a pastor to come and to fill our big box with more people and do more things and more activities and more events. And that felt like a treadmill. To be exhausted and burned out. So do I want a straitjacket or a treadmill? And I thought, neither of those appealed to me. Like, I don't want to go to either one of those churches. And yet, literally, every single church was one or the other. And it was really depressing. I got to a point where it's like, maybe I need to sell insurance. And then I found this one church profile. I believe it was August 28th, 2022. And this church tore out their pews. This church changed their name. This church made all kinds of changes. You know why? Not because they said, we want to be a big box church with lots of people. They said, we want to make disciples, and we're willing to do whatever it takes to follow the mission that God's called us to make disciples. And I'm just like, that is such a cool church. And that's who you are. That's Living Hope Church. And I want to tell you, I wish you could see yourself the way I see you. I am so blessed and privileged to serve as your pastor. Do you know how unique you are as a church? Like, do you know you are really unique and special? That there are churches all over the nation that are not like this church. And I would rather be here than any other church in the nation. And I hope you feel the same way. Like, this is awesome. So what God is calling us to is not, we need to be like the traditional church down the street. We're not called to be the big box church down the street. That we're saying, Lord, you have made this church unique. You've made this church special. You've put us in Endicott, New York for such a time as this. You've given us the people you've had. You've stirred the passions in us. And so God, we believe you have a unique calling for a unique church. And so that's why this year we're going through, and I've shared it with you before, we're going through a process called the Vision Frame. And it's very purposely, we're taking the whole year to stop, to pray, to seek God. And what we're looking for is, God, what is the unique vision and calling that you are calling this unique church to? And so we have a clear picture of where God is taking us and what God wants to do. And it's not going to look like one of those other churches. And I think that's so cool. And that it gives us permission to be who God's called us to be without trying to be like the church down the street. And that makes me excited when I think about the next 10, the next 20 years together and what God's going to do. So that we need to know our unique identity and calling. Judges chapter 7. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Morah in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. So think of the numbers. There's 32,000 Israeli troops. Now, these are not hardened troops. They probably don't have armor. They probably don't even have swords. They have spears. And they're looking down on the valley, because they're on the hills, at 135,000 troops. Battle hardened, armor, weapons, swords. I'm actually shocked only 22,000 of them were terrified. Like, I think if you ask that question, so how many of you are afraid? I'd raise my hand. I'm afraid. I'm afraid I'm going to die. And so you would expect all 32,000 to leave. But what's actually amazing is that 10,000 stayed. The 10,000 looked down at this 135,000 massive army that they were against and said, you know what, I'm not afraid. How could they be that? How could they not be afraid? Because I know whom I believed. I trust in God, and God's going to work. See, God wasn't calling many, God was calling few, but few who could stand and face the world without fear. Verse 4. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. You got to be kidding me. They're outnumbered now 13-1. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And of anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And anyone of whom I say to you, this one shall not go, you shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water. And the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, you will set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouths, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. Now, I want you to picture the difference. So they're thirsty, it's time to drink. 9,700 just put their face right in the water and just drink the water as fast as they can. So what are they doing? They're not looking around them. They're not alert. 300 of them carefully kneel down. They're looking around, they grab the water, and they're lapping the water like this. What are they doing? They're looking, they're watching, they're alert. And so there's 9,700 they're not afraid, but they're not alert. And there's 300 that are not afraid, and they're alert, and they're watching, and they're active. Verse 7, and the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and he sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, but retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. Can you imagine how terrifying that was? There's 135,000 of them, and we've only got 300 now. We've got people that aren't afraid and people that are alert, but still we're way, way outnumbered. Lord, do you have something else for us? Verse 9. That same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I have given it into your hand. But if you are afraid, go down to the camp with Purah your servant. Now notice the pattern. God keeps proving himself to Gideon. God does not expect Gideon to step out by faith without proving himself. Verse 11, and you shall hear what they say, and afterwards your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outposts, and the armed men who were in the camp. And the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And when Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. And he said, behold, I dreamed a dream, and behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian and came to the tent and struck it. So it fell and turned it upside down, so the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, this is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. And as soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream, its interpretation, he worshipped. And he returned to the camp of Israel and said, arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hand. And so they didn't have quantity, but they had quality. The people that went were just 300, but they had no fear. They were alert about what was going on, and they believed all the way that God is going to provide for us. God's going to win the victory, and we can't wait to see what's going to happen. Quality over quantity. So the third measure of eco is that we expect disciple making. So there's some of you sitting here, we're on the pastor nominating committee that called me to be your pastor about 2 years ago. And I want to tell you, in that interview process, not one of them said, we want you to grow us to be a really big church. We want you to get as many people as possible to come into Living Hope Church. You know what they said? And actually think about this every day. We want to make disciples. That's what we're about. That's what we're doing. And so that's why we walk in and we're reminded every week. We see above the door that we exist to honor God by making more disciples of Jesus Christ. And you turn and you see those 3 banners that are right there. The 3 questions: where do you belong? That God is calling you to belong, to be loved, to be valued. Who are you becoming? That God is calling us to grow into the man or woman that God has created you to be. What are you building? That God has given us a stirring and a passion to be used of God to make a difference in this world. And this is really the pattern and the 12 steps. This is our discipleship plan. And so our whole heart isn't that we become this huge church. That's not our plan. Our plan is we want every one of you, whether you have been here 50 days or 50 years, to be loved, valued, to grow genuinely and deeply in your faith, and to be transformed to be more and more like Jesus. That's our heart. And that's what success looks like. And that changes the decisions we make. That changes the way we think as a church. And that's our heart, is that we are growing together and strengthening each other to be more and more like Jesus. Don't face a big problem with lots of immature Christians. We just need a few people that are fully sold out to Christ. A phrase I heard that I just love says, the world has yet to see what God can do through a person whose heart is fully his. Think about that. Is your heart fully God's? You're like, God, I'm going to do anything. I'll go anywhere. I'll make any change that you want. Because ultimately what I want is I want a life that's powerfully used of you more than a life that's comfortable or easy. Verse 16. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies. Okay, really bad military strategy. Basic military principle, concentration of force. Especially when you have fewer forces than your opponents, you don't spread out your force. You concentrate your force. And he's violating the first principle of military doctrine, spreading his forces out into 3 companies. And he divided the 300 men into 3 companies and put trumpets into the hands of all of them. Okay, this is really crazy. They're here to fight a battle. They need swords, and he gives them trumpets. What are they going to do with the trumpet? And then, and this gets you, and then empty jars. What is an empty jar going to do against an army of 135,000? Like, this is craziness. And torches inside the jar. Now that's really dumb, because if you put the torch inside the jar, you can't see the light of the torch. What's the purpose of that? Like, I don't know where he's getting this idea, but this is really weird and actually never been done in military history before this. Oh, it gets crazier. And he said to them, look at me and do likewise. When I come to the outskirts of the camp, do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then blow the trumpets also on every side of all the camp and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Okay, so we're going to walk up to the camp without swords. We just have trumpets and jars and torches. And we're going to shout for the Lord and for Gideon, and then we're all going to die. Like, this is not a good plan, Gideon. This has never been done in military history. Now, you may think about, well, gosh, this sounds kind of like how they circled the walls of Jericho 7 times and blew their trumpets. The difference between that event and this is that God explicitly told them to circle the walls and shout. God never said that. So this actually isn't God's plan. This is Gideon's plan. And it's crazy. It's never been done in the history of military warfare. What on earth is Gideon thinking? It's totally new. It's a crazy out-of-the-box risk. Verse 19. So Gideon and the 100 men who were with him came to the outskirts of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, when they had just set the watch. Okay, there are 3 watches in the night. So there's 9 to midnight, and those people just stay up until midnight. They're very alert until midnight when they go to sleep. Then the second watch is from midnight to 3 a.m. That's when the people that slept from 9 to midnight get up, and then they watch the camp. And then the third one is 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. And so they come right at the beginning of the second watch. That's midnight. So I want you to picture the scene. It's pitch black. It's totally silent. These are people that are now giving the watch. Everyone's asleep. The watchmen just woke up after 3 hours of sleep, and they're really tired. They're rubbing their eyes. They're kind of half asleep, and they're trying to kind of get up. And so Gideon and his men come right up to the edge of the camp. Now, because they have their torches in jars, well, the light's only going at their feet. So they actually can walk right up to the edge of the camp without being seen. And what do? They blew the trumpets and smashed the jars that were in their hands. Then the 3 companies blew the trumpets and broke the jars. They held in their left hands the torches and their right hand the trumpets to blow. Where's their sword? They don't have one. And they cried out, this is funny, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon, when no one has a sword. Now, picture what happened at night. So they're all asleep in bed, exhausted. Even the watchmen are tired. And then all of a sudden they hear this loud, deafening noise coming from all around them. And everyone, boom, wakes up with the start. And then they hear crashing of the pots. And so it's loud, there's crashing noises. And then because the pots are no longer covering the torches, all of a sudden the torches shine into the camp. And it's bright when their eyes are accustomed to the dark. And so they can't see, they can't hear because it's constantly loud. And they hear a sword for the Lord and Gideon, we're under attack. So what do? They start swinging their swords to try to attack, and they see people coming at them they can barely see. So they attack the person coming at them. So what happens? This is so cool. Every man stood in his place around the camp, so they don't run into the camp. And the army ran. They cried out and fled. When they blew the 300 trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. Now, yes, that's because God instilled them with fear, but really this is something that happened because Gideon invented psychological warfare on that day. No one had ever thought of this before. This is totally out of the box and creative. And he gets the army to defeat themselves, the 135,000 to attack themselves and win the victory. And so when they blew so the Lord set everyone's man's sword against his comrade and against all the army. And the army fled as far as Beth Shittah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Malath and Tabbath. And he wins. Something you never expected. By taking a bold risk, by doing something totally out of the box that no one had ever done before. So, and this is my favorite of the 6 measures. The 4th measure of a successful church for eco is this, that we normally So I want to tell you about myself. I grew up in Silicon Valley. And something I loved about Silicon Valley, my stepfather was the chief technical officer of LSI Logic, and he would take me and show me through a scanning electron microscope chips that had gates that were 40 angstroms thick. That's 40 atoms thick. And some of the out-of-the-box creative ideas that no one had ever thought of before. And the culture of Silicon Valley was like, let's try something totally new. Let's take a wild risk and do something no one's ever done before. Well, what if you fail when you take a risk? You know what? You fail forward. You learn from your mistake, and then you risk again, and you try something else that's new, and you keep doing that again and again, and creativity comes out, and imagination comes out, and totally new ideas that no one has ever thought of. And that's the culture of Silicon Valley, and I think that is so cool. And that's something I loved about being a missionary. So when we were in Cameroon, the whole heart is like, look, this is not a Christian country. And so in a sense, we've got nothing to lose. We can't make this country any less Christian than it already is. And so we need to be curious to understand this culture and the way people think. And we need to be creative and try new things to build bridges to Cameroonian culture so they can experience Jesus where they're at. And God is moving in Cameroon. You know what? Missionaries are doing that in China. God is moving in China. In Iran, they're moving. God is moving in Iran. God is moving in India. God is moving in South America. And you know what? The churches in these other countries are a lot more creative and innovative than American Christians are. Because we are afraid of risks. We are afraid of innovation. We are afraid of creativity. We would rather fail as a church than take a risk and try something new. Because we haven't figured out yet that when the culture shifts and changes, staying the same and worshiping 1980 doesn't work. And following, let's just build a big box and try to fill it full of people, that doesn't work either. And so, if God is going to move in power in unexpected ways, you know what's got to happen here? We've got to be willing to try things that are new. We've got to be willing to innovate. We've got to be willing to do things that churches maybe have never thought of or never done before, and even willing to fail and fail forward and learn from that failure. That sounds pretty exciting, doesn't it? Why is the church the one institution that's afraid to try new things? Every other industry innovates and tries new things and is creative, but we're afraid to do that in church. Why? God is a creative God. God isn't afraid of new ideas and new innovations. God's not afraid of risks. We look through Scripture and we see God calling his people to take risks, to do new things, to be creative. It's only us that are afraid. God's people in the Bible is not afraid of this. And when I think about that, I get so pumped and excited for what God's going to do if we're willing to innovate and try something new. That we're not putting a straitjacket on our church. We're not putting a treadmill on our church. We're unleashing God to work in powerful ways. And I really believe the era that God has called us to in the 21st century that is so new and so different calls for us to be innovative and creative and take risks. Verse 23. And the men of Israel were called out from Naphtali and Asher and from all Manasseh, and they pursued after Midian. Gideon sent messengers throughout all the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and capture the waters against them, as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan." So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they captured the water as far as Beth-barah and also the Jordan. So notice Gideon's strategy was not, let's get as many people to fight a big problem. Let's get few that are unafraid, that are alert and are confident in the Lord. And let's do the crazy out-of-the-box risk-taking strategy that God has called us to do to accomplish the mission God's called us to, and watch God work. And when they are real, when they are faithful, when they trust God, what happens? The numbers come later. The people see God is moving, and the whole nation rises up and steps out and joins in the fight. And so the focus isn't how can we get lots of people. The focus is how can we be real and genuine and serve God boldly, and God will bring numbers in his time. So I hope we grow larger as a church. I would love to see this room filled up with people, but that doesn't actually happen by our trying to grow large. That doesn't happen by let's provide entertainment, or let's water down our message, or let's be shallow in our faith. No. It happens because we say, let's be real. Let's see the Spirit of God genuinely move in our midst and draw us to be living like Jesus, for Jesus, where God is moving. And you know what people are longing for? It's like they've seen the traditional church, not interested. They've seen the big box church, honestly not really that interested. I want something real. I want to see God moving in power. And so when that's our focus as a church, God will bring people in his time. And so the fifth measure is that we generate multiplying leaders, that the focus is on the quality that you are called to be a leader in God's kingdom, and that as you step out and are genuinely moved to God, God will use you as a leader. The final measure, and I would have been twisting the passage too much to make this fit, this is the sixth one. This is that we prepare to launch, that we are ready for whatever God has for us, and that we're willing to step out in faith and not just be like so many churches that just talk about change, but we actually do it. Now, I want to show you a video of a real eco church that's doing this. Now, one of the reasons I picked this church is because it's totally different from ours. And God is not calling us to be a church like Pioneer in Texas, but it gives a picture of what it looks like when a church is on mission. They're willing to know their unique identity and calling. They're focused on disciples. They're willing to think outside the box and be creative. And let's see how God can work. I'm going to play the video.
Looking back on this journey, if I could sit down with Mark from 5 years ago, the first thing I would tell him was follow where God's leading. Don't question it, because God is going to open doors that you don't know He's planning to open. We look back and see things that we thought were going to work that completely fell apart, and God opened another door and taught us this is exactly where you needed to be to begin with. You don't have to do this all yourself. God is going to lead you. He's going to provide for you. He's going to direct your path. When I look at the things that have been most successful and encouraging here, it's the things that God has done that have caught me by surprise, and I just get to be a part of it.
I've been leading worship here at Pioneer for the past 4 years now, and I would say it's grown for sure, but I like the word matured better, I would say. I just think the people that are part of the team here, we click a lot better now. We know each other more deeply. Pioneer is incredibly outside the box. It's definitely non-traditional. It definitely has a lot of character. The fact that it functions as a smokehouse, a barbecue place, it's just what we needed, because it brings people in from all sorts of different walks of life. And then we're able to say, hey, you know what? On Sundays, same place, we're going to be here worshiping Jesus and talking about Him. And you can reach people on a level that most churches can't.
We chose to come to Pioneer Mission Community because we're looking for a smaller church and one where it was biblically based and very good music message.
We've been in Brenham for 5 years, and we looked for quite a while for a church. I personally have been involved in larger churches with politics and cliques and things, and there's none of that here, and that's just such a nice departure from the norm. We all know the saying, a church is the people, it's not the building.
Right.
And so I think this is a good example of that.
There's a whole bunch of barbecue places here in Texas, but there's none like Pioneer. Pioneer is just great. You get a great vibe. You meet nice people. The food is amazing. A church as well. So you get a great service too on Sundays, which makes it even better.
I really like Pioneer because I see the Pastor Mark as kind of my role model here. I mean, the first time I came here, I didn't really know what I was getting into. And he comes over and sits down at my table for 10 minutes and talks to me to learn about who I am and what my faith looks like and all that. So I thought that was really good. Showed that the pastor truly cared about each and every person that comes here.
When I've looked at this building grow and this ministry grow from the bare bones all the way to where it is now, I've loved to see the people that come every week, because I know that this was something that we had to trust in God to do, and now we can give that trust as a testimony to other people. So that's where I've grown so much, is learning to trust in God, whether there's 3 people in the room or whether there's 15, 20, 30.
The biggest mistakes that I've made along this way is where I've felt I needed to take the reins. And in every situation, looking back on those, I hear God saying, if you had just let me do what I was doing and not put Mark into the situation, it all would have worked out, because I had a plan for you. So for those that are embarking on a new adventure or a new church or a church plant or a new job, the best advice I can give to you and hopefully to myself for the next 5 years is look for the places where God is working and put yourself there.
So I think I can confidently say God is not calling us to build a barbecue restaurant. But I just want to invite you to dream with me and dream with our church. What is God calling us to? What does really Endicott, New York need? Who are we, and how has God wired us uniquely? And what if we really were a church that were creative and thought outside the box and weren't afraid to take risks and really were bold and excited about the future? And that's something I want to be a part of, and I pray that's something that you want to be a part of and watch God do. Let's pray and ask God to work in this and power. God, thank you for Scripture. Thank you that actually all the heroes of the Bible are not all the same. They're all different. And that you work through different kinds of people, different kinds of churches, at different times in different ways, and you are a creative God. And you're not calling us to be different than what we are, or like some other church, or like some other Christian. And Lord, I want to thank you that you have firmly placed our church in Endicott, New York, and you've done that for a reason, and there's something good you want to do right here. I want to thank you for every person that is sitting in this room right now, that you brought each one of them by your purpose and your plan, and you're going to do something really good in their lives and through their lives. We pray, Lord, that you would grow us and mature us to be more like Jesus. And Lord, fill us with dreams, with creativity, with innovation, with new ideas, and give us the courage to take risks and fail forward and watch you work. Jesus, you are exciting. Being part of your kingdom is fun, and it's an adventure, and we thank you for calling us to be part of it. We thank you for your Son, Jesus, that makes all of this possible, that without him we could do nothing. And so conform us to the image of your Son. Help us to trust in you, Jesus, that died on the cross for us and shed your blood, gave your life, and rose again, so we could follow you in this life and live with you forever. Amen.